Hello and welcome to part 2 of 4-note chords. This video is going to focus on voicings of 4-note chords. To quickly review, a voicing refers to the way the notes in a chord are distributed over one or more instruments. And when I first began taking lessons with Ted Greene, I had already studied set theory, but I was at a loss as to how to begin to work through the material that I had collected. And Ted Greene taught me 14 different voicings that he referred to as the V system that I'm presenting here that really started to make sense. My great regret is that we do not have a book or a series from Ted that would allow him to present this material himself, as it was so obvious to me even at the time that his understanding of how these voicings fit together and the context that made them work was much more extensive than I could fathom. To this day, I feel I've only just scratched the surface of the possibilities that this V system suggests. However, I have published a link available in the description to a great source of additional information on Ted's V system should you choose to go a lot deeper, that has been put together by James Hober at tedgreene.com. The voicings here assume that there are 4 notes in the chord and there are no notes that are repeated or doubled in the voicing. And to continue the tradition that Ted taught me, the 4 voices in the voicing will be referred to as soprano, alto, tenor, and bass as singers. And this really changed the way that I think about harmony and that I hear harmony. Instead of a chord group or a fingering, I really tend to try to think of these as voices moving in different lines. So the soprano is going to be the highest note, the bass is going to be the lowest note, and alto, tenor will be the middle notes respectively. And there are 2 primary ways that voicings will be approached in this video and that I suggest you can start to work through this material. The first is a fixed bass with a variable soprano, and that is where the lowest note remains the same. Or you can look at it as a fixed soprano with a variable bass. So the highest note remains the same and all the other notes change with it. For the sake of simplicity, we're just going to take set 4-20. We looked at the sets in part 1, and this is set 4-20, which contains the C major 7 chord, 0-4-7-B. Those are the set numbers or set notes that outline the C major 7 chord. So we have C, E, G, and B. So we're going to look at all of the different voicings of just this one chord. So if we lay out the notes in this chord, we have C, E, G, B. Now we're going to first approach this as fixed bass with variable soprano. So the bass is going to be fixed. The note C is going to be the bass, and it will not change. Every other note in the chord will change. And so the lowest note will remain the same. So what we have is a variation or a possibility of a variation of each of these 3 other notes in the chord, E, G, and B. And we can see how E, G, and B can be extended to another octave and then another octave above that. We're actually going to stop at G only because even at this range, trying to finger that voicing on a guitar with one hand is nearly impossible unless you start to go into altered tunings or use open strings with various different kinds of voicings, or you use 2 hands, or you overlap 1 or 2 or more instruments. And that's something that we'll talk about as we kind of get through some of these voicings. So if we look at the first 4 voices, bass, tenor, alto, and soprano, and we have a fixed bass, our first voicing is what Ted referred to as V1, V-1, or the first voicing. So this is also referred to as a close or closed voicing. So this is our first voicing that we can distribute through various different sets. So if we take this voicing and we move the tenor up an octave, now we arrive at what's called V-2. And so now we have the bass, tenor, alto, soprano, except now instead of the highest note being B, the highest note is now E. And so this is V-2. Now, if we extend the G note up an octave and we drop E down an octave, now we arrive at what's called V-3 or voicing 3. And so we can see where those voices lie. The bass and the tenor are close, and then we have essentially a kind of an open triad on the top. Now, if we take this E and we move it up an octave, now we arrive at the fourth voicing, or V-4. And so now the tenor, alto, and soprano are close, and they separate out from the bass. Then if we move the B up an octave and the G down an octave, now we have what's called voicing 5, and this is what V5 looks like. And so this is akin to a kind of an open triad. We have an open triad on the bottom and an open triad at top. So this is a very open sounding chord. Now, if we move the G up an octave, we arrive at V-6. And so here the tenor, alto, and soprano are very close and distant from the bass. If we move E up an octave, again, we have this close voicing at top, separating out the bass with the high E, and this is V-7. If we move B down an octave, and so we have an open chord at top, now this is V-8. This is similar to V-5 in that it's a very open sounding chord, but V8 is even more so in this very kind of open sound and bigger sound. If we drop the G down an octave, now we have V-9. So we have this very close tenor and alto, and the soprano is distant from the rest of the chord. If we move the B up an octave, now we have a very close soprano and alto, and we have a fairly close bass and tenor, but this is V-10, or the 10th voicing. If we move the G up an octave and then move B and E down an octave, now we have voicing 11, or V-11. And you can see the tenor and the alto are very close and kind of isolated on an island away from the bass and the soprano. If we move the B up an octave, now we have, again, this open kind of voicing at the top, and again, distant from the bass. And so this is V-12. If we move the G down an octave and the E down an octave, what we get is a very interesting selection. It's V-13, and this is where the bass and the tenor are very close, and the alto and the soprano are very close. And they're both kind of separated on these kind of distant islands from each other. If we take the G down an octave, now we have this tight grouping on the bottom and with a high soprano separated out, and this is V-14. So if we look at all of these different voicings, we can see how they're generated. Again, this is all with a fixed bass, and this is just one single chord looking at all of the different ways and the various ways that it can be voiced. But it's a systematic way that you can start to explore various different kinds of voicings. So now let's look at another different way that we can try to arrive at some of these voicings. Instead of a fixed bass, we're going to look at a fixed soprano with a variable bass. So the highest note will remain the same, and we're going to change the other notes in the chord. So again, we have this notion of the C, and then B, G, and E. But as we notice that this is going down. So again, we have V1, this close or closed voicing, But here we're going to kind of hang it from the soprano. So we have the soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. So that soprano is going to remain the same, and this is V1. If we move the B down an octave, this is going to give us V2, and this is also known commonly as the drop 2 voicing. Now, of course, you can call V2 with a static bass or a fixed bass drop 2, but the idea of dropping a note an octave implies that you're dropping it, and it's going down. So therefore, looking at it from a fixed soprano perspective makes a lot more sense. We can, of course, move the G down an octave and move the B up an octave, and this gives us drop 3 or voicing 3. We can move the B down an octave, and this gives us what is called drop 2 and 3, or this is the V4 voicing. We can move the G up an octave and the E down an octave, and this is V5, or what is sometimes referred to as drop 2 and 4. If we move the G down an octave, we arrive at V6. And again, so we have the alto, tenor, and bass in this kind of tight, close voicing, along with the soprano kind of off by itself. If we drop the B an octave, now we get V7. If we move the E up an octave, now we get V8, that really open voicing. If we move the G up an octave, now we get V9. If we move E down an octave, that brings us to V10. If we drop the G down 2 octaves and move E and B up an octave, this gives us V11. If we drop the E an octave, this gives us V12. And if we move the G up an octave and the B up an octave, this gives us V13. And then if we move the G up an octave, this gives us V14. So these are all the voicings of the same chord, but looked at from a fixed soprano perspective. And there's a lot of different other transformations. We have only been looking at the transformation from V1 to V2 to V3 to V4 and etc. There's a lot of different ways that we can look at this in terms of, well, what happens if we want to transform a chord from V1 to a V5 or a V6 to a V12 and so on. So this is only one of many, many, many different ways that you can look at how to transform from one voicing to another. What we want to do here and what I want to accomplish is just showing you a basic way of trying to systematically work through some of these voicings. So there are a number of different ways that we can organize sets and voicing groups. What I really suggest you do is just start working with the ones that make sense to you and start grouping them in ways that make sense to you. If there are chords or sets that don't appeal to you, then don't worry about it. If there are ones that you want to investigate further and use different inversions and different voicings, that is something that I think is really, really useful in how we can start to play around with some of these structures. So what I want to do now is I want to give you some examples of how you can investigate and kind of figure out the sets and voicings together. So I've given you a couple of different reference handouts that are available in links from the description. But let's look at some actual examples, some musical examples. So this is the very famous Tristan chord in a piano reduction, Tristan und Isolde, the prelude by Richard Wagner. And so we have this chord, which is F, B, D sharp, and G sharp. And it turns out to be 06A3 if we look at it from a set theory perspective. So let's isolate this. So here we have 06A3. So if you take any chord and then you assign these set numbers, what I first would recommend you do is go ahead and put that in numerical order or set order. So instead of 06A3, we put it in order in one octave of 036A. So I've included this sorted sets reference handout, and this is the order of all the sets. So all you have to do is reference this one page, and you will know exactly what set it is. So 06 or 036A turns out to be set 4-27. So this is set 4-27. Now, if we look at the notes that are laid out, we can look at these in terms of a fixed bass. So F is going to be the quote-unquote root. Now, when I say root, I'm not talking about the root of the chord. I'm just saying that this is an assumed root just so we can kind of figure out these structures. And then if we kind of lay out all of the rest of the notes of the chord, we actually can use the other reference sheet and find out that this is a 0B-C A prime, or A up an octave. So this is actually a V2 voicing. So this is the way that we can start to kind of think about these different ways that these sets and these voicings can go together. So what I would really recommend you do is pick some of your favorite chords, and if you don't know what kind of voicing these are, you can start to kind of play around with figuring out, I really kind of get pulled into V3s or V5s or V2s. And you can start to extend your vocabulary and expand it beyond just the ones that you know, and start to really investigate some different sounds, maybe some that you like more. So this is another example. The next two examples actually come from Alan Holdsworth, whose harmonic language really kind of inspired me to start my work in the first place. And so here we see that there's a number of different chords that are actually the same. So this 057A chord gets repeated and moved around. So we can dispel with the chords that just repeat themselves in terms of the structure, and we can just look at these chords that have different structures. So it turns out we have three different chords that have three different voicings, 057A, 057B, and 0518. And so if we take these and we kind of spread them out, and then we look at 057A, and we're actually going to look at 0158 because we're going to put that in order of the intervals from in one octave. We find out that we have these three sets, so 0158, 057A, and 057B. And so these turn out to be set 4-23, 4-16B, and 4-20. And the first two voicings are V1 voicings because they all are contained within one octave. And this last chord is actually a V5. So now we can, if we really like that last chord, we can say, oh, well, what else can we do with V5? And we can start to experiment and expand and look at other chords from the V5 voicing. And so here's just another example of how we can do this. So we tear down the chords in terms of the notes and the intervals. So we have 0785, 0693, and 0562. So we look at these, and of course we're going to put them in order of 0578, 0369, and 0256, and then look those up in the reference sheet that I've included here, and we can see that these are the three different voicings, or the three different sets rather, 415B, 428, and 414. So now we can start to look at these, and these turn out to be all V2 voicings because they're 0B, C, A prime. So again, whatever you call these, however you organize them, it's not the gospel here. It's just giving you some suggestions on how you can start to investigate and kind of put together these into a way that you can systematically start to play through some of these different sounds, or really understand what vocabulary you are attracted to and what kind of harmonic language you really want to use. So really, it's at the end of the day, it's all about your ear, but these also give you a lot of tools that you can use to start to expand your language, or to at least understand the language that you're using. So if we put all of this together, we have the 43 primary four-note chords from part one, and some of those are actually repeating. For example, the diminished chord is the same in every inversion, so we don't count those as four separate chords. So it actually turns out that we have 165 four-note chords. If you look at the addition of 14 primary four-note voicings, that brings us to 2,310 chords. Now, of course, not all of these inversions and not all of these voicings are going to be equal, and that doesn't mean that all of these different voicings are going to quote unquote work or fit together in a way that makes a lot of musical sense. But what that does mean is that there is a great variety of different chords available to us just from a four-note structure or a four-note idea of how these notes can go together. The other thing that I really want to leave you with is the idea that you don't necessarily have to voice the four notes as a single chord on the guitar. You can, of course, have combinations where perhaps one guitar player plays two notes and another guitar player plays two notes, and that combined makes four-note voicings that possibly wouldn't be practical in terms of voice leading and chordal playing for a single solo player, but makes a lot more sense, or a lot more musical sense. So it really expands a lot of the different sound colors that you can achieve. And then if you start to add, of course, bass players, keyboard players, and such, you really get a rich variety of orchestral possibilities. But at the end of the day, really, this is all about experimenting with the sounds that you care to make. So in part three, we're going to be looking at how scales and chords fit together in terms of these four-note chords, and different ways that we can kind of put the voicings in there as well. So we're going to expand what we've done in part one and here in part two. Thanks so much for listening.